Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. As India celebrates 75 years of independence, what have those 75 years meant for India's southern states? They're not just a critical part of our federation, but many believe they are by far the most dynamic part. Joining me to explore that question is the Finance Minister of Tamil Nadu, P. Thiagarajan. Mr. Thiagarajan, in 1962, in his maiden Rajya Sabha speech, the founder of your party, the DMK, Annadurai, said, and I'm quoting him, "Dravidians demand the right of self-determination. We want a separate country for southern India." Although after the Chinese war he changed his mind and dropped this demand, 60 years later, has this sentiment completely disappeared, or does it linger in minority quarters?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this chance to give a perspective from the South. Actually, your question is a very profound question, because we have to go back to the roots of what we call the Dravidian movement, which we all belong to and whose tenets we all follow. And the core of it was this notion of self-respect. You see, in a culture that had millennia of stratification of human beings by, who can do what and who can go where and who must do what and so forth and who must not do what. The notion of breaking these bonds and breaking these structures and hierarchies started with the notion of self-respect. Self-respect means because I am born, I am equally a human being as anybody else. And I don't need to get validation or respect from anybody else to be considered of some status. Why that's so important is, if you start with the notion of self-respect, everything flows from that. You start with self-respect, the next logical step is independent thinking. Therefore, you got to have education. You got to have the capacity to reason for yourself, rational thinking. Then you go pretty quickly from there to say self-determination. Should I not have some say in how my life is going to turn out? And all over the world, this kind of thinking leads to the next logical thing, which is local self-governance. So this notion of we should have a bigger say in how we are governed, that we should have the right to self-determination, flows from the core principle of self-respect, of social justice, of everybody's equal. And it was that basis on which Pererangan, the founder of the DMK, made his comments back in his maiden speech in the Rajya Sabha. But as you say, there was a kind of tension between the notion of self-respect, self-determination, rational thinking, etc., and the notion of a nation, which, as you know better than anybody, it was carved out of, again, a culture that was thousands of years old. Many different rulers had come and gone at different times. At some time, it was integrated under Ashoka, the great emperor, some part of India, some part in southern India, we had the great Chola Empire. Then we had the invaders, we had the Greeks come in, we had the Mughals come in. So this land that had been in history for millennia and with like civilized progress from the Indus Valley onwards, suddenly you were creating a nation out of something that had never been before. And therefore, you had to find some way of balancing the two. And I think that's the balance, especially after the China war, that made Anna switch his views.
But tell me, has that sentiment, that request or that demand for a separate country completely disappeared, or does it linger in some quarters of Tamil Nadu to this day?
Yeah, it's hard for me to say what all exists at what levels, but I would say the thirst for self-determination, the massive support for states' rights, the huge opposition to a centralizing, colonizing force, whether that colonizing force starts from Delhi or from London, all those are innate to our existence, in our blood. So, I'm not sure what the kind of nation concept is. I don't go around taking polls on these, but the right to have self-determination is innate to our existence, and that continues.
And that continues. Okay. Now, in 1962, when Annadurai made this demand, it didn't really create such a stir. Nehru may have blanched, but he regularly accepted Anwar Rai's right to free speech. Had Anwar Rai spoken today, the response would have been very different. It would have been considered sedition. He might have been arrested immediately. What does this tell us about how India has changed over the last 75 years?
It tells us something that we should all feel both concerned and I mean, even maybe alarmed, and certainly less than very proud about. Because, you know, free speech is integral to the progress of the society. We fight for freedom. What does freedom really mean? Freedom surely includes a component that is free speech. And we are increasingly becoming a society, though it's not unique to India, but it's happening all over the world in some extent. But, you know, it doesn't bother us what happens outside in other countries. We are Indians. What happens in India bothers us. This notion that there's only one acceptable approach, there's only one acceptable perspective, that there is a know-all, be-all, you know, force, and everybody else must kowtow, otherwise you'll be branded anti-national. Forget sedition. You'll be branded anti-national and some epithets like urban naxal and all these kinds of nonsense. This should alarm us greatly. This is not the sign of a healthy, progressive country with a great future.
So what you're saying is the fact that what Anwar Rai could say without any fear and without any reaction in 62 would be considered anti-national and sedition today suggests that India has not progressed. It's become narrow, it's become intolerant, it's become anti-democratic. That's what you're saying, isn't it?
I am saying it's a regression. I'm saying that when the notion of a country was only about 15 or 20 years old, when it was not clear whether it would survive, when, as I say, you carved out this country out of thousands of years of culture and tens of kingdoms and all history, even then it was considered acceptable speech. Now you have this country that is strong, vibrant, robust, has a big defense force, 75-year track record. You should have thought it should put down all those fears and allow for even more openness. In fact, we have regressed to the point where, you know, there's a very narrow spectrum of acceptable speech and everything else is labeled immediately unpatriotic, anti-national, urban naxal, all this nonsense. So it's a regression, I would say. It's a regression of democracy. It's a regression of freedom.
Against this background, let's explore the relationship between the states and the central government. India officially is a union of states. Federalism is a key part of our constitution. The federal principle is fundamental to the integrity of India. From your point of view, as you see things from Chennai, how effectively and how sincerely have we implemented and adhered to the federal principle?
Again, I'll just start maybe at a slightly earlier point in time. I think in the Constitution itself, though the word federalism and though the notion of federalism and though the words union of states appear, in fact, if you take our Constitution relative to any other country in the world that is either advanced or large or both, we have a very, very central power focused kind of Constitution. There's very few other places in the world. I've made this point many, many times. I'll make it here again. If you take, you know, avowedly, self-avowedly communist China on one extreme, and again, self-avowedly capitalist America on the other extreme of the right-left spectrum. In both of these countries, the devolution of powers to the states, to the districts, to the cities, to the panchayats equivalent are much, 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 much greater than was even envisioned in the Constitution. Right? So I lived for 20 years in the US. The town or village that I live in has its own school board, its own police force, its own kind of retail laws, and so forth. The county I lived in set its own sales tax and its own liquor laws. You know, the state I lived in collected its own income tax, gave its own permits. And this is true in China. You go, the mayor of Shanghai has his own police force, has his own environmental clearance, has his own industrial permits. This is how devolved countries work. In our case, maybe because of this, again, trying to carve out something out of nothing, trying to create a country that never existed before, after saying all these words that came from their hearts, the actual constitution was actually a very central focused constitution. Now that became worse and worse. During emergency, Mrs. Gandhi amended the constitution and took a bunch of subjects away from the state list into the concurrent list. And those of us who came from relatively prosperous, relatively progressive states were keeping on complaining about the centralization from independence. In fact, that drove a lot of Anna's concerns. Anna's concerns would have been much less had we had a truly federal constitution and true devolution of powers. Now, the irony of all this, let me just say one last thing. The irony of all this is, in the modern era, in the last 25 years of India's history, the greatest champion of states' rights, the greatest complainer against centralization was none other than the Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat. I say it again and again and again. Every single thing I say about states' rights that I have ever said in any public platform is a milder version of something that Narendra Modi has said as Chief Minister of Gujarat. So this is it's not unique to the Dravidian, it's not unique to the Tamilian, it's not unique to PTR. It is a concept that is natural to all states.
But you're making a very important point. You're saying, despite the fact that our constitution commits us to a federal devolution of power, and despite the fact we talk about federalism, the actual devolution has been fairly minimal and nothing like what the states would have wanted. Now, you cited the example of Narendra Modi and the contrast between his rhetoric when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat and his behavior today as Prime Minister of India. When he first became Prime Minister in 2014, he spoke about cooperative federalism. A few days ago on Independence Day, he spoke about competitive federalism. How do you understand these terms, and do you welcome them, or are they in your eyes just rhetoric?
I think they're not just rhetoric, they are misleading rhetoric. I think when the actions and the words are completely opposite to each other, then you have to say that it's an attempt to subvert the reality by creating a myth or a perception that is false. Every action the Union government has taken, from the introduction of GST to legislation on state subjects, to writing policies on things that are clearly within the state's domain, education policy and so forth. These are counter to the notion of devolution of power. So every action, cooperation is a state subject. Why is there going to be union legislation on it? Agriculture is a state subject. Why were there 3 major farm bills? Dams and ports are state subjects, minor. Now they're going to regulate that also out of Delhi. So this notion that you can say the words and then your actions are exactly opposite those. In most democracies, that would not be kind of sustainable. Somehow in our democracy, a lot of people don't seem to ask the question why the words and the actions are directly 180 degrees opposed to each other.